Hello and welcome back to the Security Conversations podcast. My name is Ryan Narayan and my guest this week is Caleb Sima, CISO at Robinhood. Caleb, what is this Chief Security Officer at Robinhood do? Can you define your role and mission over there?
Sure. Our job is to enable our employees to do things safely. So I like to say we allow them to do unsafe things safely and enable the business to accomplish what they need to do.
So you view it as security as this business enabler that gets out of the way and get people getting things done in security in the midst of mitigating risk to the organization and keeping breaches at bay and so on. You take that part of it really, really seriously where security is not the guy saying no.
We do. Although, what you find, I think it's easy to say, hey, we're a business enabler. We don't want to say no. And that is the overall theme and goal that we want to achieve. However, I find practically it's not as simple and clear as that, right? Like it depends on the level of maturity of the organization, the team, the project, the form around. Sometimes you have to say no. And there are times where you have to draw a hard line. And there are times where you have the ability and the maturity and capability to say, absolutely do this. And we have the right way and the safe way to do what you're doing. So in general, that's our goal. That's our mindset. That's what we want to achieve. But it all really does vary in a practical way as to where you have to draw the line to say no versus yes.
So you look like a very, very young man, but in internet years and in cybersecurity years, like you go way back. You come from a different generation of folks who were there at the beginning. I believe, can we talk a little bit about your background? I believe your entry into security might have come in the 1990s, which really, really dates us both. Can you talk a little bit about how you landed into this space, and then we'll pivot a little bit to the entrepreneurial bits later on. But how did you end up here?
I was one of those kids that I think always got in trouble, and somehow my rebelliousness turned into computers. I remember I was playing around on a BBS. So if you guys remember bulletin board systems before the internet, so this is probably 92 or something, 90, somewhere around there. And there was this article that I read on how to make free payphone calls. And I said, wow, you can do that. And went and learned how to build a red box. And from that point forward, it hooked me. And I think my first actual security job, I was hired at this company called S1 or Security First, which was based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And I was hired as the sole security person managing and deploying firewalls at that time at this company. And that was my first real security job. And I think that was in 1995.
Completely different landscape, right? I mean, security wasn't even a thing then. Firewalls was the extent of what security looked like.
Firewalls was security, and it was not even, there was not even really a security title. It was, you were part of IT, and your job was just to go manage this thing.
I feel like we're heading back there. And the security specialist is starting to go away. And there's some arguments that the security specialist should go away and it should live in IT, and IT should become the security people. But that's a different conversation.
Not at all. But yeah, I can have that discussion all day long. Go ahead, Ryan.
No, I want to go back to the late 90s and kind of paint the picture of what that looked like, because a lot of your peers from that time also was big thing is self-taught. A lot of it was figuring out and fiddling and figuring things out yourself, versus today where there are, university courses and training and certifications and everything. It feels like it was a lifetime ago. Things were entirely different, and you guys were hodgepodging it from scratch. Can you talk a little bit about how that era and time set you up for decisions about going into business and becoming an entrepreneur? And when did you realize that cybersecurity was a thing that was outside of IT and it was becoming a real thing with companies and programs and so on? When did that kick in?
Yeah, well, as we're speaking here, I'm so old that I was part of security when it was, I think, a culture and not an industry,
Mm-hmm.
right? There wasn't jobs around. Cybersecurity wasn't even termed as a term. It was a bunch of people
Yeah.
just hacking and doing things. And I think when it started, I think when firewalls started coming around, people started learning how to hack things. And I think it started when the bullets started coming is when companies said we need ways to protect ourselves from the bullets, right?
Right.
And I think that's where the inauguration of, oh, hey, like we need to start finding these things and protecting ourselves and hiring individuals who knew about this. And at the time, most people did not know about this. And it was a learned thing on your own because it was a little bit of the underbelly of technology, right?
Right.
And I think when I started at S1 doing firewall things, at the time there was this company called Internet Security Systems, and they built this
Robert
thing
Graham.
called ISS scanner. This is Chris Klaus and Tom
Chris
Noonan.
Klaus's thing.
Yes,
Right.
yes, and they created this sort of internet security scanner that you would scan hosts on the internet, find vulnerabilities, and it became a thing. And they started turning it into this standalone business, where it's like, oh, if you want to find how hackers look at your things, this is what you use. And they had in this prototype phase this thing called Real Secure, which they termed intrusion detection. And I remember when I was at S1, I got sent this thing. And my job is I want to go see if this thing works because it's the next thing that is not a firewall, right? Because firewalls were all we had.
The real next gen was there.
This next gen was this term, and I identified a whole bunch of flaws in this software, and that ended up me getting a job at ISS as a researcher. And my job there was to, okay, well, how do we, reverse engineer software and write exploits? That was my job. And so start publishing exploits. And you can, if your Google foo is good enough, you could still find my old exploit advisories from ISS that I wrote that are probably still roaming on the internet somewhere. But
how important and cool was it for you to be in Atlanta at that time? Because I feel like you mentioned S1 being in Atlanta. There was Georgia Tech, ISS you mentioned, IBM X-Force, I believe, was down there. Mark Dowd had a stint down there as well. It felt like, and my recollection of the early 2000s was that Atlanta being a hotbed for cybersecurity. Was it specifically because of Georgia Tech? And can you talk a little bit about what that scene was like at the time?
Yeah. When you think about back in those days, the kinds of companies that were security companies, right? And you start thinking about them as not consumer, not like at the time, this was like Norton antivirus, I think, like in those days. But I think enterprise companies, internet security systems, network associates, I think VeriSign, there are a few of these like sort of old, sort of at that time new, but bigger sort of organizations focused just on security, which was really,
B2B
really
security.
rare.
Because for the most part, the security ecosystem was antivirus, consumer things, protecting personal data.
Right.
At that time, you're talking about it became a B2B enterprise thing where businesses need to be protected. But what were the attack surfaces and what were the things that drove that at the time? Because we weren't dealing with worm attacks, we weren't dealing with ransomware at the time. What were the threats that you guys are dealing with?
I think you were dealing with people doing defacing of websites at the time. I think you had a lot of people popping into different parts and causing destruction and mayhem in organizations. There was a lot of focus on, still even today, credit card theft, a lot of those. And back then, by the way, firewalls were just starting to become a standard. And so I think web applications were just starting to take as a form of business and the front door to the business. And so you started seeing a lot of web application attacks started to happen during those timeframes. And so that's where you're starting to see sort of the evolution of the tech stack. And of course, with that comes the evolution of the attacker. So
the stack is starting to get built there, and the evolution of the attacker became webapp, which segments perfectly into your first startup, which was SPI Dynamics, right? And you were focused entirely on this webapp security space. How did you come up with that idea? Talk a little bit about the early days of SPI Dynamics.
Well, when I was at ISS, one of the things that I did was I basically led pen testing at ISS. Okay. And by the way, it wasn't called pen testing back then. We didn't have that word. It was, hey, Caleb, go justify the purchase of our products by breaking into the companies so that they know how to plug it. And actually during that time, I was part of X-Force. So X-Force came out of ISS. And I remember
this
leading
is pre-IBM's acquisition.
Pre-IBM, pre-IBM acquisition. I went through the ISS sort of IPO back in the bubble.com days, back in those days. And my job was just go break into companies. And so what you start finding out, obviously, in doing this is the fastest way I started figuring this out was through websites. And at the time, this was way back in the day, things like cross-site scripting didn't even exist yet, right? And so it wasn't even a termed thing. SQL injection was barely just popping on the scene.
We're still in the 1990s. When did SPI Dynamics get started? 1998, 97, 98?
No, so I was doing pen testing in 1998. So 1998, 99, and 2000 was when this was happening. And so I just started breaking into everything in web. I mean, there was nothing I could not break into. And so during that time, obviously, what you want to do is you want to start automating the things that you do manually.
Right.
And so I started automating that. And I remember I actually was talking with a customer and showing them, hey, here are all your issues. And they were like, how did you find all this? And I'm like, I do this stuff. And he was like, hey, if you were to like give that to me, I'd buy it from you so that I could run it instead of you running. And I was like, really? He's like, yeah, like, how much would you pay? He's like, I don't know. How much would you charge? And I was like, I don't know, 20K. And he's
Might
like,
be
sure.
onto something here.
Yeah. He was like, I'll buy it. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And so I think that then rolled into me starting my company called SPI Dynamics, and we created a product called Web Inspect, which is, I have to say, sort of the world's first black box web scanner back in those days. And so that was basically a creation of mine and automating all the work that I did. And we had a lot of, SPI and Web Inspect, we had a lot of great claims to fame. I would say that not a lot of people understand. Like we do have we have a patent on actual web application scanning. So you go and look at it. Like if you try to web scan, we have patents on it. It was between us and this other company called Sanctum back in the day during these time frames. We also were solely responsible in helping PCI, web security, getting into PCI. Which people will either punch me for or they will shake my head
applaud you for.
Applaud me for. But we started driving a lot of application security and product security really being another area and segment that you needed to focus on.
It's so fascinating listening to you because I feel like fast forward to 2022, like this is the Bishop Fox story, right? This continuous scanning, continuous assessment in this web application space, everything comes around full circle all over again. I just had guys on my podcast that do bug bounty for a living and they talk exactly what you said. I'm breaking into things and then I figure out I can automate it and build tools. And now the really good bug bounty guys are like doing this in an automated way with tools. What did you learn from the SPI days? How long did you guys have that before the HP acquisition? Like what was
it? Was 7 years. So I started in 2000 and we got acquired in 2007.
So and that was 7 fulfilling years of being a CEO and building that out, or was it?
I was the CTO and founder at SPI.
Okay.
And it was very fulfilling. It was some of the best times I've had in life. I mean, at the time I started the company when I was 19, and so I grew up. SPI was sort of my family, right? I grew up, all of those people that I worked with, I built like long-term, that was my family. That was my high school experience, right? Like
we just met PJ a couple of weeks ago who came up the old SPI days. Rob Reagan and some of our mutual friends were old SPI guys, right?
That's right. Yeah. So Rob is Bishop and PJ is Palo Alto. And like and like that whole, it was a little bit of like a family that kind of spread and then they kind of built amazing things even on their own. Right. So, but all those people have, it's a great family experience and, people that we'll never forget. So
I just talked about like how everything comes full circle again. And a lot of the things you're doing now is the roots are back then. Are there any parts of security that you look at 2022 and say, why the hell are we still dealing with this? Were there things that you expected would be solved by now? And what are some examples of things that really sit around like an old sandwich that, we've been struggling with this since the 1990s, early 2000s, but we're still not there yet?
Here's the thing, like I actually started this journey into being on the defensive side of most of my career has been sort of this entrepreneurial starting companies. Right. I actually switched over to this because exactly what you said is I actually looked at this and said, hey, I'm going to go build another company. What problem should I go solve? And when I looked at all of the cybersecurity startups, they were all building this really amazing technology. They were doing all these really cool things. But when you actually go look at the breaches that occurred, they were all happening due to very ignorant and dumb things that like, an open database on the internet, an unpatched box, all of these things, you're like, something does not reconcile here, right? And so I said, as opposed to go asking a bunch of people, I've been in security, as we discussed here, a long time. I've never defended a company. So I said, right. I am going to go figure out what that is. And that's when I kind of jumped. And during this process, what I figured out is that, hey, like none of these problems get solved, Ryan. They are the same problems, just in different tech stacks, right? It's all a people, process, politics problem. And at the end of the day, it's not that we don't have technology to not have that database get open on the internet. It's the fact that there's so much confusion, complexity, and process that happens in organizations that, hey, this database just gets forgotten about, right? Or some individual says, oh, the security controls are way too much of a pain in the butt. I'm going to go outside of the bounds and go throw it out and do it this way, right? Sometimes security is the cause of its own problem sets. But I said, like, when I look at the things that are stale sandwiches, I mean, patching is still a problem. We just have more things to patch now, right? Attack surface is way more of a problem. It's not like you can just firewall things. We just have more things to try to firewall in more layers and more areas, right? Identity authentication. It's not that we've solved that. We just have more of those things to go figure out identity of. Now I've got IoT versus a person versus a partner versus some sort of plugin that I've got inside of my software. It just extends that problem just extends to so many different layers and so many attack surfaces.
Yeah, I'm listening to you and I'm hearing Mudge do his testimony before Congress talking about what the reality is at a fully billion-dollar company with what we perceive to be a very, very mature security program. And he talks about this vulnerability scanning, attack surface management, identity issues, where's data, who has access to it, who has touched it. All of these issues are like, if Mudge and Twitter are having these issues, how do you expect anyone else to have a grip on these things? And I get the sense that you're either a pragmatist and a realist who's just going to deal with the reality of it, or you're a pessimist who are just like, we're just circling our tails, trying to cope. Where are you in terms of mindset? What is your security, mantra?
Oddly, I'm an optimist.
Really?
In a certain case. So here's why I say that. Like, when I think about most of my career hasn't been in this operations defensive role, I like to think about the way the world should be, right? Not the way that it is today, the way that it should be. And when I walk into these organizations and I see the problems that we have, in my mind, I go to what should it be? How can we get to a place where it's so much better, but done in a better way, a different way? And so to me, that's more of an optimistic sort of view. And then my goal is, how do I start that journey to get us to that place, but do it in a pragmatic, realist way, right? So it's not that you need to be able to say, like, let me give you just an example. It's like, hey, the ideal state is that any person in a company only has access to the things they need when they need it, right? Like that is a optimistic, idealist state to get to. No organization is really at that state. But then how do you even start the journey to get on that state?
So the pathway to that state is your security posture.
That's right.
The pathway to get into perfection. That doesn't exist.
That doesn't exist. And what are the different ways of getting there? Faster, quicker, better. Those are all of the decisions that get made down that path.
And you mentioned people, technology, process, and politics. And the politics part of it never really gets discussed a lot here. And I want to throw the question to you this way. As you've had a stint at Capital One, Databricks, before Robinhood, and I feel like you're an example of CISO tenures being very, very short. relatively short. On average, depending on who you believe, it's
2.5 years.
18 to 36 months, right? How can
Actually,
you,
Capital One was shorter. I think it was like a year and a half, and then Databricks was 2.5 years. So
how do you, as a CISO, implement transformational, foundational things and changes when tenures are so short and the politics of it plays a role? I mean, we talked about much briefly, but getting top-down support and getting executive-level sponsorship for your security program and doing it right and buying into everything becomes the politics of it. When you think about technology, processes, and all of that, which is the hardest to get right?
It's a hard question to answer. And I think it depends on the stage of organization. For example, at Capital One, I was entering an extraordinarily large, very well-established organization with their own practices and culture. Right. And so for there, you have to think about, well, where is it that you can make the most impact in the time that you're there that can help make some sort of difference in an organization that is quite large.
Right.
And I think in those aspects, you have to sort of pick the one thing, right? What's the one thing that you can really say, I can make an impact on and go win, and it's going to be impactful to the organization in the best way that it can.
And that can be done in a 2-year window?
Absolutely, it can. Yes.
Give me some examples of some things some peers of yours can focus on, and those one things. Like, what are some of those one things that are really doable? Because you can't say, I'll implement multi-factor authentication across this organization. It's like, it's such a complicated, complex process that takes years and years. I talked to Dan Lawrence on supply chain issues. This is a 10-year process before we can even get to a stage where we feel comfortable, right? Like, what are some of these small things that you think we can get done in a 2-year, 3-year window?
So let's take Capital One as a great example. At Capital One, when we walked in, there were two big issues that I think were right off the top. The first was sort of, what are our assets? What do we own? Right? That's a really big question.
Just visibility. Right.
Visibility, which, by the way, this was, before all of these asset companies that you're seeing today. Right. This was actually
before vulnerability management reemerged as asset management or asset.
A little bit, yeah.
Attack surface management.
Attack surface, yes. And so you just have to say, well, what do we own and where is it? And it was a very manual process, right? I literally asked, like, hey, well, what do we do this? And it would take, a very considerable amount of time, and it would get returned in spreadsheets. Right? And saying, okay, well, this is how many firewalls we have, right? And you get this spreadsheet. Hey, there's got to be a better way for us to be able to understand our assets and get it in an automated fashion. And there was a significant move to improvement inside of the organization on being able to go do that. The second thing that we did is we had tons of teams in Capital One that all had their own production cycle of how to get things to prod, right? They had their own teams, they had all of their own things and how they needed to do things. And so when you start saying, well, how do you safely build a software product and deliver it? Like, it was everywhere. There was no centralization, no ability to do this. And so there was a big problem. Do you come to every development team and say, you have to use the static code analyzer, you have to go do this? And that's not an approach we took. We said, let's build a service. Let's abstract our code analyzers and build a pipeline so that we can hot swap them in different areas for different types of technologies. And we started, when I was there, we had nothing. At the time that I left, we built an entire SDLC pipeline that not only automated all of the analyzers, it was rolled out by most of the org. I think 70% of the org had rolled it out, all completely on their own. We had no stick. They actually self-registered themselves, connected their dashboards, connected their repos to it. And in fact, engineering was then working with that team on putting in linting and other aspects of gates in this pipeline. And so these were two really big wins. I think that, in that time frame, we were able to take from zero up to real production rollout spaces. And it took a lot of hard work. And look, it wasn't me, right? It was all of the team and what they focused on. But driving those factors and putting support behind those factors is part of, I think, our job.
Are you able to do that job easily when putting out all these fires, though? Because I feel like whenever I talk to CISOs, that's the point, right? You're trying to make these transformational changes and do these, long-lasting things that have impact and effect in the organization. But you're constantly distracted by little ransomware incident here, this incident here. how do you as a CISO navigate that balance? Like
you have to pick something every year that you're going to go get done. And it's got to be something big, and it's got to be something that balances, right? And so, like, I'll give you a good example in Robinhood. One of the missions that we had last year for that year was passwordless. We want to enable our customers in Robinhood to log into their application and do it in an easy but yet safe manner.
Right.
And the best experience is, how do we enable something like passwordless? And so we prepped. That was one of the missions for the customer facing side of our org. That's what we want to go do. And it took a long time, right? But we prepared. And when iOS 14, when iOS 16 came out and the new iPhone came out, we were one of the first apps immediately already in production supporting passkey. And so now in Robinhood, you can actually use passkey and do a passwordless experience. We're not all the way there yet. We're not finished, but this is an example. You got to pick 1, 2, or 3 things depending on your org and their focuses. That is the one mission that every week you can make some progress on, despite all of the fires that you're going to have to go deal with. And so that's how I think about it. And those are the missions that we've got to go accomplish in that year.
We're running out of time, but I want to give you a chance to weigh in on, because you live in a world where you're seeing everything. You're being bombarded and inundated with salespeople and marketing people with all the shiniest new toys. And we like to make fun of VC funding, shiny new toys, and we like to make fun of RSA and all the show floor stuff. But in reality, there's a lot of really interesting, fun, useful innovation happening in the startup space. And instead of beating up on startup land, give me a positive spin on what you've seen. What are some of the technologies, innovation? What are some new interesting things you're seeing that should excite us that we're heading in the right direction instead of just recreating these cycles?
One thing that I have seen that I think is a little bit more in the right direction is I've seen a lot more companies start to really focus on breach and post-breach. I really am under the mindset of assuming breach. That's your what's the word? What's the right word? Your mindset, philosophy. Yeah, your philosophy and mindset is assume breach and deal with detection and response. Yeah, assume the attacker is already inside your organization, and what are the things that you do?
Isn't that defeatist?
Right? Not at all. It's the one thing we've got against them. It's the one advantage we have for the attacker.
How so?
Because the attacker doesn't know where to go, but we know where the attacker wants to go, right? And so if you know that, then you also know where are the areas that you should start focusing your controls, your visibility, the areas that you need to protect. Because there's a lot of the organization that isn't that important, but that attacker doesn't know that. They're going to be stumbling around trying to figure out what is important and where to go. If we know where that is and we can make that assumption, and by the way, today I would also ask, how do you differentiate between an attacker or an insider, right? I don't think there's a way to differentiate that.
Yeah.
So
I come back to the Mudge testimony again, right? It's like there's so much at stake with the insider, outsider, it's all the same.
It's the same. So but the thing that you do know is that if that attacker is going to do something, they're either going to steal something, destroy something, right? Those are the two things that they really got. And so where are they going to go do that? Where it's the most impactful. And then you can start thinking in those mindsets and start figuring out how to lay those plans. And I don't think assume breach is just detection, right?
So you're bullish. You're bullish on folks doing response.
I really like the fact that two. I think I really like the fact that response is being paid attention to and how you react. Because again, it's not. I think the famous quote is, "You can never prevent a breach, but you can absolutely respond how you respond to one." Right? It's actually you judge your security team not whether they prevented one, but how they respond.
How they responded to it.
Yes. And so response has been very, very, I think, not focused on in the past. And I'm starting to see a trend where we're really focusing on that breach, response, reaction aspect of things. That's the first that I'm really seeing a good trend on. The second that I'm seeing good trends on is actual fixing and remediation. or really creating secure assets from the beginning. These are things that I'm really emboldened for, like the paved paths.
Right.
There's no sense right now for engineers to go and absolutely create resources directly with, let's say, AWS. You can have an abstraction where the engineer can click, I need an S3 bucket, and it can create a nice, safe S3 bucket with all of the things you need ready for you to go in a much easier fashion. And this is an example of, I think, safety being embedded into the platform, into engineering in a way that is abstracted away from engineers. And those are things that I also see a trend of that I'm very positive.
And you see investments and innovation happening there that should excite us.
I do, yes.
And since you're the optimist, I'll let us end it right there at something that excites us. Thank you very much, Caleb. Appreciate it. I know that we've been trying to get this set up for a long time. The invitation is open. Come back anytime you have something to say or you want to make a point. I'll make sure you get a proper follow-up invitation.
Will do.
Thank you, my friend.